My name is Michael Silberstein, and I'm part of the Sinai Temple Men's Club, and want to welcome everybody for attending this morning. I got to tell you, this is a fantastic treat and enriching to our souls to be in dialogue and in lesson with Rabbi Golinkin. I think it's something when we walk, started the rest of our days, and Rabbi finishes his day. I think we'll be truly enriched by his wisdom and understanding and knowledge. So I want to, thank Farshad Rafi, the president of the Sinai Temple Men's Club, for giving me this honor to welcome the rabbi and be part of putting together today's program. Farshad, thank you very, very much. So a little logistics. The rabbi is going to present, I believe it's about 5 different topics today, and content will be about 45 minutes. We welcome all your questions. If you can put those through the chat window, and Rachel from Sinai Temple, who's on the line with us here, she'll be reading out questions when we get to the Q&A, but your questions are definitely welcome. We're recording today, so not that anyone's face or pretty outfits are going to be shown here, but the content will be recorded, which, one, want to make you aware of that, and 2, we will be sending the link out to everybody. So you can send the link out to folks who could not attend so they can glean this wonderful wisdom. So you didn't come here to listen to myself. You came here to hear from Rabbi Golinkin, but let me just give you a little background on Rabbi Golinkin. I'm impressed. I was in awe of reading about him. So I hope this gives great color to who he is behind his striped shirt and kippah here. So Rabbi David Golinkin was born and raised in Arlington, Virginia. Beautiful kippah. He made Aliyah in 1972, earning a BA in Jewish history and 2 teaching certificates from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He received his master's in rabbinics and a PhD in Talmud from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where he was also ordained as a rabbi. Professor Golinkin is currently the president of the Schechter Institute and president emeritus of the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, where he also serves as professor of Jewish law. For 20 years, he served as chair for Vad Hakalah, the law committee of the Rabbinic Assembly, which writes responses and gives halakha guidance to the Masorti movement in Israel. I think everybody's familiar that clearly Sinai supports and raises money for the Masorti movement. He is the founder and director of the Institute of Applied Halakha at the Schechter Institute, whose goal is to publish a library of literature for the conservative movement and Masorti movement. He's also the director for the Center of Women in Jewish Law at the Schechter Institute, whose goal is to publish responses and books about women in Jewish law. In 2014, Rabbi Golinkin was named by the Jerusalem Post as one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world. Clearly, our beloved Rabbi Wolpe is part of that list too, so now you got an idea of who you're in store to hear today. In May 2019, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Jewish Theological Seminary. And guys, get this one. Rabbi Golinkin is the author or editor of 59 books, including Halakha for Our Time, an index of conservative response to Halakha studies from 1917 to 1990. The list goes on and on of his writings and where he's edited, and it's really amazing. And before I get into Rabbi Golinkin, one of the things that just really struck me in reading one of his most recent articles on the art of saying Todah, Rabbi Golinkin said, I think this is your quote, Rabbi, from Irving Berlin. If you're worried and you can't sleep, just count your blessings instead of sheep. And you fall asleep counting your blessings. And I think that's our blessing today, is that we're able to hear and be taught by you. And let me hand things over to you. We're all blessed to have this opportunity, and I'll come back in about 45 minutes, and we'll see what our participants have as questions. And does that sound fair? Did I miss anything on?
That's fine. Thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Toda Rabbi. Thank you, Michael, for that beautiful introduction. I'd like to thank the leadership of the Sinai Temple Men's Club, Farshad, who was already mentioned, and Carrie Lehrman. I met with them a number of months ago, and we discussed something that we could do together with the Schechter Institutes. And we decided to offer this lecture before Rosh Hashanah. I'd also like to thank Michael himself for the planning and many of the technical issues related to this shiur, to this lecture, and to Rachel on the staff of Sinai Temple. And if there's anyone else I forgot to thank, excuse me. Before Rosh Hashanah, Toda Rabba, thank you all. I bring you greetings from the Schechter Institutes in Jerusalem. I'm sitting in my study at the Schechter Institute behind the Israel Museum. We teach and reach 85,000 Israelis every year through the Schechter Rabbinical Seminary, which trains conservative/Masorti rabbis for Israel and for Europe. And we also have overseas students as well, for example, from the Seminario Rabbinico in Buenos Aires, the Schechter Graduate School, which has 400 students, most of them teachers, principals, and communal workers in Israel who are doing an MA in Jewish Studies. Of course, now they're doing it by Zoom. They used to do it in person. The Tawi school system in Israel, which is a subcategory of the secular public school system, where we have 65,000 children in the Tawi school programs in Israel. Our outreach center in Tel Aviv called Neve Schechter, which specializes in Jewish music and Jewish art. And finally, we have an entire network of synagogues and schools in Ukraine called Midreshet Yerushalayim, which has been operating now for 30 years, reconnecting the Jews of Ukraine to Judaism. One of the last things I did on my last trip to the US in March was that I spoke at Sinai Temple on Thursday night, March 5th, which I really enjoyed. There were about 50 people there. I was told that a lot of people didn't come because they were already afraid of the COVID-19 virus. And Rabbi Erez Sherman and others told me that that was the last public event held at Sinai Temple before lockdown. And this reminds me of a story told me by one of my rabbinic colleagues in Jerusalem a few days ago. He says that after a few months of lockdown, a husband says to his wife, "Well, dear, we've decided that we don't want any children, but I guess we have to tell the kids tonight because we're all going crazy from being at home for such long periods of time with our children, in our case, sometimes our grandchildren, and it's obviously a new situation compared to normal times." And I was reminded of my current situation by this past week's Torah portion, which was a double portion of Nitzavim Vayelach. And at the beginning of the second portion, Vayelach, Deuteronomy chapter 31, it says, "Moses went and spoke these things to all Israel. He said to them, I am now 120 years old. Lo uchal od latzet velavo. I can no longer come and go." Obviously, Moses was saying he can no longer come and go because he was an old man. He was 120 years old. Our situation today is that we can no longer come and go. I was supposed to fly to the States last night. Every year I have a high holiday pulpit in Toronto. I also raise money for the Schechter Institutes throughout North America 4 or 5 times a year. I was not able to come and go in June. I was not able to come and go in September. I may not be able to come and go in November. But I think that this forced staying at home, this forced lockdown for many of us has given us time to think and to contemplate more about life, about our current situation, about our place in the world. And I think that's why, together with the leadership of the Men's Club, we chose the topic, Essential Values of Judaism for Times of Stress and Change. And what I would like to do with you in the next few moments is discuss 5 basic values of Judaism, which I believe can help us deal with the current situation, both at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur time, and perhaps for the next year, until a vaccine is developed for this terrible virus. And I'd like to begin with the first value, and this is the one where I'm going to share some sources with you, except that I believe that you need to allow me to share sources, Rachel. So if you can let me screen share, that would be good. If you're there,
Sorry,
Rachel.
1 second. Yep, let
That's
me
okay.
getting
I'll
it.
share
Okay,
my
I'm gonna
screen in a
make it.
minute.
Okay, you should be able to now.
Okay, excellent. I just have to find the sources if I can. I don't see them. Okay. There we go. There we go. Can you all see? Rachel, can you see the sources?
Yep, they're good to go. We can see.
Okay, good. Okay, so the first value I'd like to discuss with you is the value of humility. In Hebrew, anava. I think that the tendency of modern men, especially modern people in Western society, is to think that we're in charge. And if you may recall, there was a sitcom in the 1980s called Charles in Charge, which I never saw. I just remember the title of the sitcom. We think that we're in charge. We're not in charge. God is in charge of the universe. We are little peons, very small, very, very small pieces of that incredible universe, which we are part of. And this is, of course, one of the themes of the high holidays. Before the Musaf service, the Chazan or Chazanit gets up and sings Hineni. And this I Xerox from the Machzor Lev Shalem. On the facing page, there's Hineni for a female prayer leader. This is for a male prayer leader. Hineni Animi Mas. It has a beautiful tune. Hineni Animi Mas. And what is the purpose of this prayer? The purpose of this prayer is to say, I, the Chazan, I'm a nobody. I'm not really very important. I don't know why I've been chosen to represent the Jewish people in prayer. I'm not really worthy of it. I'm not smart enough. I'm not old enough. I'm not learned enough. I hope that nonetheless, God will accept our prayers and forgive the Jewish people. In other words, the major poem, the major piyut before the Musaf service on Rosh Hashanah is the Chazan saying, I am not worthy of representing the congregation in prayer. The message is one of pure humility. The second source is a very famous source in the Torah, which we read a few weeks ago in the weekly portion, in the portion of Akev, Dvarim chapter 8. And here I'm going to read from the sheet in front of me because my eyes are not that great. And what does the passage in Dvarim say? Take care lest you forget the Lord your God and fail to keep his commandments. When you have eaten your fill, this is in verse 12. When you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered, beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget the Lord your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness. Verse 16, who fed you in the wilderness with manna. Verse 17, and you say to yourselves, Kochi ve'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh. My own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me. Verse 18, remember, and this is on the next page, remember that it is the Lord your God who gives you the power to get wealth in fulfillment of the covenant that he made an oath with your fathers, as is still the case. In other words, the very natural tendency of human beings is that when we succeed in agriculture, or we succeed in business, or we earn a lot of money, or we do something praiseworthy, we say, ha, it's me. Kochi ve'otzem yadi, my power and my might. That is why I have succeeded. And Dvarim chapter 8 says, no way. It's not because of you. It's because of God. God took the Jewish people out of Egypt. God gave them food for 40 years. God brought them into the land of Israel. Without all of that, you wouldn't be enjoying your crops, and you would not be enjoying your flocks, and you would not be building your houses in the land of Israel. You would still be slaves in the land of Egypt. So the second message of humility comes from Deuteronomy, Devarim chapter 8. The third message of humility came to me as I was preparing for this lecture, and I remembered a famous Talmudic story. I'm holding up, you all know that Rabbi Steinsaltz died in the past few weeks, who did the incredible translation into Hebrew and English and other languages of the Babylonian Talmud. This is from the tractate of Gittin, folio 56b. I'm not going to read you the story in Hebrew because it's not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic. So this is the famous Sansino translation of the Talmud done in the 1930s. And it's a story about Titus. And in Hebrew, it has a ring to it. It's called Titus Vahayitush, Titus and the mosquito, or Titus and the gnat. And Titus was the Roman general who destroyed the Second Temple. And this story describes in great detail exactly what he did. We don't know how much of it is true and how much of it is a legend, an agadah. And it says that he went into the Holy of Holies in the temple and he took a harlot and he lay with her in the Holy of Holies. And then he gathers up all the utensils of the Holy of Holies in a curtain and he puts them on board a vessel to go back to Rome. Here in the middle, I underline some of the passages. And a gale springs up at sea, which threatens to wreck the ship. And Titus says, apparently the power of God is only over water. When Pharaoh came, he drowned him in water. When Sisera came, he drowned him in water. He wants to drown me in water. If he is really mighty, let him come up on dry land and fight with me. And then a voice comes out of heaven and says, Chote ben chote, sinner, son of a sinner, descendant of Esau the sinner. I have a tiny creature in my world called a gnat. Go up on dry land and make war with it. And the end of the story proceeds to tell that this gnat went into Titus's brain and banged away there for 7 years. And in our modern terminology, we would say that it turned into a brain tumor and it killed Titus. I don't think that this Talmudic story is meant to be taken literally. The point of the story is that Titus, who was the most powerful general in the Roman Empire, who went on to become the emperor of Rome between the years 79 to 81, he was felled by a gnat. The most powerful man in the world was felled by this tiny little creature. Well, that is exactly our situation today. The entire world is at the mercy of a virus that we cannot even see. And just as the story of the gnat was to teach humility, that even the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor, is under the control of God, so too we have remembered since March that we are under God's control and we do not run the universe. And finally, if you didn't get the message yet, we return to the famous poem Unetana Tokef in the High Holiday Liturgy. And this is the end of the poem Unetana Tokef by Zirax Marzor Lev Shalem, page 144. Adam Yesodo me'afar v'sofo le'afar. Each person's origin is dust, and each person will return to the earth having spent life seeking sustenance. Scripture compares human beings to a broken shard, withering grass, a shriveled flower, a passing shadow, a fading cloud, a fleeting breeze, scattered dust, a vanishing dream. And you are the sovereign living God, ever present. Your years never end, your time has no measure. The extent of your glory can never be imagined. In other words, the poem, after talking about who will live and who will die, reminds us that we are fragile human beings and that God is eternal. And of course, we ask God's mercy and ask him to let us live in the year to come, provided that we do tshuva. So the message of these 4 texts, the Hineni prayer on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Deuteronomy chapter 8, the story of the death of Titus, and the Unetana Tokef prayer, Adam Yesodo me'afar, is that we must maintain a sense of humility, not only in the high holidays, but throughout the year. And I think that this COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call to remind us that Charles is not in charge, and we are not in charge. God is in charge, and we need God's help, and we need God's mercy. The second value, and now I'll stop sharing so you can see me in a larger screen. The second value I would like to talk about by my time this evening, by your time this morning, is a sermon I once gave on Rosh Hashanah which I published in abbreviated form on the Jerusalem Post this past April 13th. In the Jerusalem Post, it was called The Art of Saying Todah. It's also called An Attitude of Gratitude. One of the most basic values of Judaism is that we have to learn how to say Todah. We have to learn how to thank God and our fellow human beings, not just to think our gratitude, but to express our gratitude. And this year, Rosh Hashanah, which is coming up this week, starts on a Friday night. And what is one of the standard prayers we recite on Friday night? Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat, Psalm 92. Tov laodot l'Adonai l'zamer l'shimcha elyon la'agid baboker chastecha v'emunatcha balelot. It is good to give thanks to the Lord and to sing your praise, O exalted God, to talk about your kindness in the morning, v'emunatcha balelot, and your faithfulness every evening. In the 19th century, Robert Louis Stevenson said, "The man who has forgotten to be thankful has fallen asleep in the middle of life." Unfortunately, by Stevenson's definition, I think that most people are asleep. We do not express our gratitude to God as we should. We do not thank our families as we should. Why is this so? Why do people neglect to thank each other? Why do we forget to praise God for his beautiful universe, for food, clothing, shelter? I think there are three reasons for this human tendency. The first I already described from Deuteronomy chapter 8. I'm not going to repeat it, which is that when something good happens, we thank ourselves. When something bad happens, we blame God. But we never thank God for the good that happened. When good happens, I made a killing on the stock market. I earned a lot of money. I got a doctorate. I did this and I did that. But if it's a bad time, all of a sudden it's God's fault. So when something good happens, we forget to thank God. There is a second reason why we frequently lack a sense of gratitude, and that is because we lack a proper sense of perspective. So I'll tell you a personal story. For the past 50 years, with a few exceptions, I have been serving as a rabbi and or a chazan on the high holidays in various synagogues in North America. And I was scheduled to fly to the US on September 13th, 2001. As a result of the horrendous attacks on September 11th, my flight was canceled, my meetings were canceled. I didn't know if I could get to the States and Canada at all. One of my friends said to me, "Why are you so calm?" I replied, "It's a matter of perspective. There are 5,000 people missing and presumed dead in New York. The World Trade Center has been destroyed. Tens of thousands are stranded in airports all over the world. So why should I be upset? It's a question of perspective." And the third reason for our lack of gratitude is our attitude. People tend to find in life what they expect to find. If you look for positive things, you will find them. If you look for negative things, you will find them. And again, Ein chadash tachat hashamesh, there's nothing new under the sun. This was stated by Ben Zoma in the Tosefta Tractate of Brachot some 1,800 years ago. Ben Zoma was a friend of Rabbi Akiva, 1,900 years ago. What did Ben Zoma say? A grateful guest says, "Bless my host. How many wines he brought out for us. How many portions he brought out for us. How many cakes he brought out for us." An ingrate says, "What did I eat? One piece of bread, one cup of wine. Everything he made for his wife and children." The grateful guest and the ingrate ate the exact same food, yet one utters nothing but praise, while the other utters nothing but criticism. It's all a question of our attitude. How can we overcome these three tendencies? I think that we can use three techniques that have been developed throughout the ages. Through them, we can acquire the ability to say Todah, thank you. The first technique, as Michael mentioned, was summed up in a beautiful song by Irving Berlin. I have here a picture of my parents of blessed memory, Rabbi Noah and Dvorah Golinkin, Zichronam Livracha. Everything I know about Irving Berlin, I learned from my mother, Dvorah Golinkin. And what did Irving Berlin teach us? If you're worried and cannot sleep, just count your blessings instead of sheep, and you'll fall asleep counting your blessings. If we stop for a moment and actually count our blessings, we will be surprised to find that our blessings far outnumber our misfortunes. The second technique for cultivating an attitude of gratitude can be summed up in one of my favorite expressions. If we all went out to the marketplace, hoping to exchange our troubles, we'd each come home with our own. Our troubles are usually much less than other people's troubles. And the third and last technique for cultivating an attitude of gratitude is to learn how to verbalize our thanks. It's not enough to think about the fact that we are grateful to God. We must express it in our prayers. It's not enough to think about how grateful we are to our families. We must tell them so, and often. And now we can relate to our current situation as we grapple with the COVID crisis in Israel and throughout the world. Our natural tendency is to gripe and complain. 25% of Israelis are unemployed. I cannot go to work on a regular basis. I could not attend a Seder. I could not attend a Tikkun on Shavuot. Who knows if I'll be able to attend our holiday services? I still don't know. I think that Bibi's having a news conference now to announce what the plan is for Rosh Hashanah. And if we're stuck at home in Rosh Hashanah, we'll only be able to go 500 meters from our houses on foot. All this is true. But let us learn from Ben Zoma. We are much better off than past generations who experienced plagues like the Black Death, which killed between 75 and 200 million people, or the Spanish flu, which killed between 17 and 50 million people. They did not know the cause of those plagues, and they could not heal those who became ill. The same is true of many plagues recorded in the Bible, the Talmud, and our own responsa literature. We in the state of Israel should be very grateful. We have a government which is doing everything that it can to save every life that it can. It sent El Al to the ends of the earth to retrieve Israelis from all sorts of exotic places. The IDF distributes food parcels wherever it is needed. Doctors and nurses and thousands of volunteers test people and cure people and help people of every age and every religion. We should thank God that we live in the state of Israel and thank all Israelis who are helping one another overcome this plague. So the second Jewish value that we need to cultivate in the year to come is an attitude of gratitude. The third value I would like to discuss was encapsulated in a sermon I once gave on Rosh Hashanah, and the sermon is called Running. And I began, as is my custom, with a joke. You'll decide whether it's funny or not. And it's a joke told by Jerry Clower of Mississippi of his good buddy, Reverend Sam McAlwee. One day he had to preach a funeral, but he got a flat tire. He opens up the trunk, takes out the jack, fixes the flat, rushes off to the church, but no one is there. He says to a few people sitting there, "Is the funeral over?" And one says, "Well, they're gone." He says, "What direction did they go in? Where's the graveyard?" "Well, the deceased was Aunt Hattie Simmons, and she grew up in Oak Grove, so I reckon they're taking her to Oak Grove Cemetery." So Reverend Sam jumps in his car, rushes out to Oak Grove. He saw a graveyard, and way on the hill past the graveyard, there were two fellows throwing dirt in a hole. He jumps out of the car, runs up the hill, looks down in the hole and says, "Well, I reckon I should say something since I miss preaching at this poor old soul's funeral." So he says, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We will remember this beautiful old lady the rest of our lives. Amen." He runs down the hill, jumps in his car, and rushes off to his next appointment. Well, Udell and Vernell Ledbetter are leaning on their shovel handles as they watched him drive off. And Udell looks up at Vernell and he says, "You know, that's the first time I ever heard anybody preach a eulogy for a septic tank." You see, the Reverend was in such a hurry to get to the funeral, he didn't bother to find out whether he was really at the funeral. So he preached his eulogy to a septic tank. This is not the only time in human history that this has occurred. Here is another story, which is a true story. And this is a story of a famous British biologist named Thomas Huxley in the 19th century. Fearing he would be late for his own lecture, Huxley jumps on a passing horse-drawn carriage and orders the coachman, "Top speed." The driver lost no time, whipped up the horse, stormed the horizon. It took a little while, but eventually Huxley sticks his neck out of the cabin and shouts at the horseman, "Do you know where I want to go?" And the driver answers, "No idea, sir, but I'm driving as fast as I can." Just as in the story of the Reverend, Thomas Huxley was going where he was going very fast, but the driver had no idea where he was going. But the most tragic tale of this sort is found in the Bible, second book of Samuel, chapter 18. You can all look it up in your JPS Hebrew English Bible. It's a very tragic story told about Absalom, David's ambitious son. Absalom tries to seize the throne. David was forced to leave Jerusalem and cross the Jordan River with a small band of people who supported him. Before the decisive battle between the armies at a place called Machanaim, which still exists, David says to his troops, 2 Samuel 18, verse 5, Le'at li lanar la'Abshalom, deal gently with my boy Absalom for my sake. In other words, he tells his troops not to kill Absalom. After a fierce battle, David's army emerged victorious. However, Yoav ben Tzruya, David's chief of staff, chose to ignore David's command, and when Absalom's long hair becomes entangled in a tree, Yoav kills Absalom. The story continues in the book of Samuel. Achimaat, son of Tzadok, says, let me run a report to the king that the Lord has vindicated him against his enemies. But Yoav said to him, you shall not be the one to bring tidings today. You may bring tidings some other day, but not today, for the king's son is dead. And Yoav says to the Cushite was a professional runner, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bows to Yoav and runs off on his mission. But Achimaat, son of Tzadok, again says to Yoav, no matter what, let me run behind the Cushite. Yoav says, why should you run, my boy, when you have no news worth telling? I'm going to run anyway, says Achimaatz. Then run, says Yoav. Achimaatz ran by the way of the plain, and he passed the Cushite. Achimaatz was known in the Bible as a very fast runner. He passes the Cushite. When Achimaatz arrived, he calls out and says to the king, all is well. He bows low with his face to the ground and says, praise be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against the Lord my king. The king says, is my boy Absalom safe? And Achimaatz answers, I saw a large crowd when Yoav was sending your servant off, but I don't know what it was about. In other words, he didn't have a clue what to say. The king says, step aside and stand over there. So Achimaatz steps aside. Just then, the Cushite, the professional runner, comes running up, and the Cushite says, let my lord the king be informed that the Lord vindicated you today against all who rebelled against you. The king asks the Cushite, is my son Absalom safe? And the Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rose against you to harm you, fare like that young man. The king was shaken. He went up to the upper chamber of his gateway, and wept, moaning these words as he went, Bini Absalom, mi yitain muti tachtecha hayom. My son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. This dramatic story describes two runners. The first, Achimaatz, was clearly the faster runner, but despite his speed, he failed in his mission. When David asked him, Hashalom lanar Avshalom, is my boy Avshalom safe? Achimaatz didn't know what to say, so he mumbled something incoherent about seeing a large crowd before he ran off. The Cushite, on the other hand, was not such a fast runner. He arrived second and lost the race. Yet when King David said to him, is my boy Avshalom safe? His reply was diplomatic, yet entirely clear. Yiyu kanar oivei Adoni HaMelech v'chol asher kamu alecha lera'ah. May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rose against you to harm you fare like this young man. We are all runners on the road of life. We push and we shove and we run hither and thither, constantly striving to win the race. Yet I fear that many of us are suffering from the Achimaat syndrome. We know that we want to win the race, but we don't know why we are running. We want to get there first, but we don't know where we are going or what we are going to do when we get there. We frequently look and sound like the white rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. Oh dear, I shall be too late. Oh, the Duchess, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting? Or perhaps we sound and look like the people in the famous poem by Michael Koist. I went out, Lord. Men were coming and going, walking and running. Everything was rushing. cars, trucks, the street, the town. Men were rushing not to waste time. They were rushing after time, to catch up with time, to gain time. Goodbye, sir, excuse me, I haven't time. I'll come back, I can't wait, I haven't time. I must end this letter, I haven't time. I'd love to help you, but I haven't time. We all spend our lives running and running and running. The good thing about this pandemic is that it forced us to stop running. We had to stand still, not for a day, not for a week, but for many months. We had to spend time with our wives, whom perhaps we never talked to. We had to spend time with our children. We had to spend time with our grandchildren. We called people we hadn't talked to in ages. We Zoomed people we hadn't talked to in eons. We stopped running and we started thinking about the important things in life. So I think that a positive message that we can learn from the present pandemic is to stop running, to stop being like Achimaatz, chasing our own tail, and rather stand still to think about what's important in life and what are the important things that we should think about and emphasize in the year to come. The fourth thing that I would like to talk to you about briefly is how to turn curses into blessings. And the text that I start with in this particular sermon is a very famous liturgical poem, which everybody in Israel quotes at this time of year. It's a Sephardic poem. The poem is called Achot Ketana, and the phrase is, Tichle shana v'kilaloteha, tachel shana ubirchoteha. May the old year end with its curses, may the new year begin with its blessings. But my question as we approach this Rosh Hashanah is, how can we turn curses into blessings? And as you probably know, the most famous example of turning curses into blessings in Jewish history is the famous example of Bilam. Bilam was a prophet who was hired by Balak to curse the Jewish people. And he comes and he overlooks them from various mountains. And each time he's supposed to curse the Jewish people, what comes out? A blessing. And the question is, why? So according to a passage in the book of Dvarim, the reason that the curses turned into blessings is because God changed his mind. Instead, the Lord God turned the curse into a blessing for you, Deuteronomy chapter 23. And this idea is expressed also in a Midrash. When Bilam came to curse Israel, God twisted his tongue around and he began to bless instead. In other words, this is something miraculous. It has nothing to do with human beings. God turned the curses into blessings. However, I like another explanation found in rabbinic literature in the tractate of Baba Batra. And there we have a different explanation for why the curses turned into blessings. It says there that when Bilam saw the exemplary behavior of the Jewish people, he changed his mind and blessed them instead. And Bilam looked up and saw Israel encamped tribe by tribe, Numbers 24. What did he see? Rabbi Yochanan said he saw the openings of their tents did not face each other. He said, this people are worthy of having God's presence rest upon them. And the Rashbam explains, what does this mean? It means that their tents were set up in such a way that if you were standing in the opening of one tent, you could not look into another tent. In other words, they built their camp in a very modest fashion so that people should mind their own business and not peek into what's going on into their neighbor's tent. In other words, Bilam turned his curses into blessings because he was impressed by the behavior of the Jewish people, and he was so favorably impressed that he changed the curses into blessings. And this Jewish concept was beautifully captured by Mendel Moicher Sfarim, one of the founders of Hebrew and Yiddish literature in the 19th century. And Mendel Moicher Sfarim said, there is a kind of cheese which is full of bacteria, and gourmets pay a high price for it and consume it with relish. Just so is Jewish life. Its bitterness is its wondrous savor. In other words, the bitterness of Jewish life, the persecutions we have endured, are really what has turned Jewish life into something special and into something sweet. And I believe that that is the lesson of Jewish history. In Jewish history, there are three classic examples of the Jewish people turning curses into blessings. The first example is slavery in Egypt. What could be a bigger curse than slavery in Egypt? Whether we were there for 210 years or 400 years or 430 years, according to three different verses, we were slaves for 100 years. What's the big bracha? What's the big blessing? The blessing is that we use that lesson to learn ethical behavior. And time after time we are told in the Torah, "Va'avtem et hager, ki gerim heitem be'eretz Mitzrayim," and you shall love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We took the curse of slavery into Egypt and turned it into the blessing of helping the stranger. Example number two, what could be a bigger curse than the destruction of the second temple? In the year 70 CE, the temple was destroyed. We already talked about Titus a few minutes ago. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were sold into slavery and exile. The temple was destroyed. Biblical temple Judaism was destroyed. And yet the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, transformed the curse into a blessing. They replaced the temple with synagogues like Sinai Temple. They replaced the sacrificial system with prayer. They replaced the inherited privileges of priesthood or kihuna with the rabbinate. They created the Mishnah, which became the basis for the Talmud and all of Jewish law. They turned military defeat into spiritual victory, which has been a blessing to the Jewish people for the past 2,000 years. And finally, the last example happened in recent generations. What could be a bigger curse than the Holocaust? 1/3 of the Jewish people were brutally murdered. Thousands of Jewish communities were wiped out, and the survivors had nowhere to go and no families to which they could return. And yet between 1945 and 1948, the Jewish people rose from the ashes. Many of the survivors, including some of my own relatives, made their way to Israel. They fought for the land and settled her. They built cities and planted crops. They created the Israeli army. They revived the Hebrew language. And Israel has become one of the most important high-tech centers in the entire world. In other words, they turned our worst disaster of the Holocaust into our greatest blessing, the state of Israel, which continues to grow and prosper. So I think that what we can learn from the story of Bilam, and especially from the three examples I gave from Jewish history, is that it's possible to turn curses into blessings. And our challenge now and in the year to come is how can we turn the curse of this pandemic into a blessing? How can we use it an opportunity not only to help other members of our synagogue, Sinai Temple, but other Jews throughout the world and other non-Jews throughout the world, to turn the curse into a blessing? And I just want to conclude, since I don't have time for my fifth value that I was going to teach you, I want to conclude with two true stories of recent events. One of the nice things that happened here in Israel during the past few months is that people in Israel, most people live in apartment buildings. People who live in apartment buildings began to help and look out for each other. If there was an elderly woman or an elderly couple in an apartment building, the other people in the building began to buy food and other necessities for that person or for that couple. Scout troops and other Israeli youth organizations began to deliver food to elderly people and people who could not get out of their homes. Similarly, in our programs in Ukraine, one of the nicest programs we've been running there for months is that the teenagers in our synagogues in Ukraine, in Midreshet Yerushalayim synagogues, they have been delivering food and medicine to the older members of those synagogues. And the last example I'd like to give you was a story I heard just a week or two ago from Rabbi Neil Cooper of one of the conservative synagogues in the Philadelphia area. Technically, it might be in Cherry Hill. And he told me that his chazan, the cantor, Eugene Rosner, decided that for every yahrzeit in the synagogue, since many people, they're having Zoom services, but many people could not come to services in the usual fashion, the chazan calls up that particular person who's observing a yahrzeit and recites the El Malay prayer on the telephone with that person. And Rabbi Cooper said that this was an incredibly meaningful way of helping that person observe the yahrzeit, which of course is so different from the normal way in which we would observe the yahrzeit in the community. So these are two examples of delivering groceries and medicines to older people and of reciting an El Malei Rachamim, a prayer on the telephone. These are two examples of turning a curse into a blessing. So in conclusion, I would like to stress that there are many, many values that I think we need to stress at this difficult time, but the four that I have stressed here today are: number one, the value of humility, that we have to understand that we are not in charge, that God is in charge of the universe, and we are very, very small particles within that universe. Number two, to develop the attitude of gratitude, the art of saying todah. We should thank God and our fellow human beings on a regular basis for all of the miracles of life. Number three, we run. Sometimes we need to stop running, stop entirely, or at least slow down and rethink our objectives, rethink our values, and use the slowing down period in order to succeed even more in the future. And finally, the ability to turn curses into blessings, which we learn both from Bilam and from the lessons of Jewish history. I hope that we will take these four Jewish values with us, not only during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but throughout the year 5781. And now, if you have questions or comments, please feel free. I understand that Rachel is going to share some of the
Yep, I have
questions.
one so far. Bobby Meth asks, speaking of gratitude, how can we make those younger than 30 grow to appreciate the value of Israel as those of us over 60 do? None of the Zoom meetings I attend about Israel or Zionism seem to have young attendees.
That is indeed a great challenge for the Jewish world today. I'm 65 years old. I remember most of Israel's wars, not all of them, very vividly. I remember watching the Six-Day War on television. It wasn't like today where you could watch every minute of everything live, but you certainly could feel that you were there. The people in the older generations, Israel's first generation and second generation, it was very easy for people to identify with Israel. They understood and knew what had happened in the Holocaust. They understood the miracle of the rebirth of the state of Israel, and they literally saw all of the attempts to destroy the state of Israel in the Sinai campaign, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the war in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. Now that, relatively speaking, Israel lives in security, people are simply don't have that sense of gratitude and don't realize the miraculous nature of the state of Israel. And the only way we can overcome that is by education. And the education cannot start when our children get to a college campus and are being attacked rabidly by activists on the other side. They have to get that Jewish Israeli education all the years that they are growing up. As it says in Pirkei Avot, Da mashet tashiv lapikoros, you should know what you should reply to a heretic, says Pirkei Avot. If you want to have the answers in college, you cannot learn them the day before you go into college. We have to teach our young people all about the history of Israel and the justness of the cause of the state of Israel during all the years in which they are growing up, through our Hebrew schools, our day schools, Camp Ramah, USY, so that by the time they arrive in university, they know exactly what to answer those who make up lies and defamations of the Jewish state.
A couple people want to know, what is the fifth value?
The fifth value is the value of chesed, or kindness, which is mentioned innumerable times in the Bible. The most famous passage being Micha, well, two most famous passages. One is we sing, Ad Hashem, Erachum V'Chanun. We sing the 13 attributes of God. And one of them is Notzer Chesed La'alafim. He extends kindness to the 1,000th generation. But the other famous passage is found in the book of Micha, chapter 6. I'm sure we all know the verse. Higid lecha Adam ma tov u'ma Adonai doresh mimcha, ki masot mishpat ve'avat chesed ve'atznei alechet im Elohecha. O man, you have been told what is good and what is the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. And in this particular sermon, I stressed the Jewish value of chesed, of kindness. And I said that it's not enough to think that this is an important value, which the Bible obviously does, but we have to learn how to do kindness. And Chazal called that gimilut chasadim, which I cannot translate into English. It's usually translated as to do deeds of loving kindness, but it's chaloshes. It's not a good translation. Gemilut chasadim is the bestowing of chesed, the bestowing of kindness, which is considered one of the highest values in Judaism. And my contention in this sermon was that what we need to do at this particular juncture in human history is not just to learn the verse from Micha that God requires of you to love chesed, and not just to say that gemilut chasadim, that bestowing kindness is important, but we have to learn how to pass on kindness, from one person to another. And I gave three very interesting and extended examples of how specific people passed on kindness to other people. Some of the examples were Jewish and some of the examples were not Jewish, but I think that the lesson of chesed, of kindness at this particular juncture, is not just to be kind to the people in your immediate vicinity, which might be like mom and apple pie, but rather to pass on kindness to people that you don't know, to communities that you don't know, to do whatever you can to help other human beings. Because if one person passes on kindness to another person, and the second person passes it on to the third person, and the third person passes it on to the fourth person, then one of my kindness Rebbes, as he put it, I just want to say it in his words. He said that you should pass on kindness. It's like a ripple in a pond. In that way, one person will help many people. Those people will in turn help others, and the world will be filled with kindness. And that is the fifth message, which I just said, al regel achat, on one foot, which I think is particularly appropriate at this particular juncture in human history. It's not enough just to take care of ourselves and to take care of our immediate family and friends. We have to learn how to pass on kindness to those less fortunate than ourselves, both within the Jewish community, in the general community, and in the state of Israel.
People are also wondering if you can share that sermon. So maybe if you email that to Michael.
The one about kindness?
Yes. We can pass that on to people.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that.
Another question that we have, if we are to thank God for all that we have been given, how do we reconcile our troubles with God, since he is also the source of the misfortune?
That is the $64,000 question, or with inflation, the $128,000 question. I recently read an interview of Rabbi Wolpe, who's an old friend of mine, in the foreword. I don't remember what the subject of the article was. It was sent out by Sinai Temple, but the subject of his interview was theodicy. Theodicy is a fancy way of saying God's justice. And theodicy is, of course, one of the hardest questions of human history. And I don't know if any of you have ever read the book of Job, which it might be good to read at this time of year, or certainly at this time of human history. Job is a righteous man who loses everything, his family, his cattle, his possessions. And the entire book of Job deals with the subject of God's theodicy, to which there is no answer. We don't know why Job suffered. This question reiterates itself in many places in the Talmud, but the most famous passage is in the tractate of Brachot, the first tractate of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, folios 6 through 8, roughly. You have 2 entire folios of Talmud there discussing the question of tzaddik viralo rasha v'tovlo. Why are there righteous people who suffer, and why are there wicked people who prosper? And the rabbis of the Talmud, one of their answers to the question was, as it says in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, da matan shel tzadikim, matan scharan shel tzadikim la'atid lavo. The reward for the righteous is in the world to come. In other words, the rabbis of the Talmud dealt with this problem by saying that a righteous person might suffer in this world, whether it's not having enough money or clothing, or being persecuted by the Romans, as they were. You may know the story of the famous 10 martyrs, the 10 rabbis who were killed by the Romans, which is part of the Avodah service on Yom Kippur, Musaf, the Musaf service on Yom Kippur. And we don't know why the righteous suffer. So the rabbis of the Talmud said that the righteous suffer in this world, but will be rewarded in the next. If you're expecting me to give you a simple answer to the question, why do the righteous suffer? And why have so many people been killed by the COVID virus? Unfortunately, I do not have the answer to that question. I think that no rabbi or philosopher in human history has the answer to that question. There are many, many beautiful things in the universe for which we can thank God. And there are many things in the universe that are not so beautiful, which we don't understand. We have to take the good with the bad, because that is life. Life has good things and life has bad things. And as it says again in the Bible, Hashem natan v'Hashem lakach, yehi shem Adonai mevorach. God gave and God took. May God's name be blessed. We don't know why. If we knew why, we would be God. So therefore, we are left with the questions. And I think we need to thank God for the things that are good, to pray to God to change the things that are bad. But if he doesn't change the things that are bad, that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It just means that we don't understand Darkei Hashem. We don't understand the ways of God. Because if God simply did whatever we said, he would be like a jukebox. We stick in the coin, we press our selection, and that's what we get. But God is not like a jukebox. We don't necessarily get what we want in life. So we continue to pray. We continue to do chesed to try to make the world a better place, but we do not have the answer to the question as to why do the righteous suffer.
Not a question, but a statement from Jane Goldberg. She just wants to say that it has been an honor and a privilege to be present with Rabbi Golinkin, Michelle, and my dear cousin Michael. Toda Rabah for such a heartfelt session.
Thank you very, very much. It's my pleasure as well. And wherever you are, whether in California, Florida, or anywhere else, it's been a pleasure to talk to you from Jerusalem.
Yeah, Rabbi, there were 2 other questions that came up in the chat, and I've actually find both of them fascinating. One was a compliment, starting a great talk, but the question is, how can some parents and grandparents who haven't seen their families, because they live too far to travel, reconcile in these very hard times? And the second question, which is somewhat related, is it was talking about the new generation. And this person talks about, for example, Seth Rogen. If not now, they complain that they weren't taught about all of Israel's warts and flaws. What's your opinion about Seth Rogen and how to deal with people like him?
Right. So in terms of reconciling, my understanding, Michael, if you'll put your picture back on for a second, my understanding is the question is, if you fought with a family member, how can you make up with them if you can't see them, if you can't see them in close proximity?
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Correct.
Right. So, the concept of tshuva is a very well developed concept in rabbinic literature and tshuva means more than repenting. Again, it's a word that you can't translate into English. But the rabbis in the Talmud...
Clarification, didn't fight with family if they're far from their families, and they're not able to reconcile based on that, distance-wise.
Right, but reconcile implies that they disagreed about something, or just that they want to be close?
She's saying just not able to see them because of the distance.
Right. Okay, so first I'll talk about reconciling in terms of tshuva, and then I'll talk about the other problem. If I'm sure you can find it on the internet, I recommend that before Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or during the 10 days of penitence, you read Maimonides' Laws of Repentance. Maimonides, as you may know, was one of the greatest geniuses in Jewish history, maybe the greatest genius in Jewish history. The scope of his works are just unbelievable, and many peoples have spent their lives studying Maimonides and have not begun to complete the study of Maimonides. And he felt that his code of Jewish law has to include the laws of repentance, which are not usually found in codes of Jewish law. You know, usually codes of Jewish law tell you how to pray, how to keep kosher, business ethics. They don't tell you what to do with your feelings, with your personal lives. And the Rambam included the laws of repentance in his code of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah. And I urge you you can find it online in English, to study the laws of repentance. He gives you very specific situations and how a person can repent and reconcile with a friend before Rosh Hashanah. And the most famous passage that he quotes is found in the Mishnah at the end of the tractate of Yoma. And every rabbi can quote this to you by heart. Averot sheben adam lamakom Yom Kippurim mechaper. Sins between man and God, Yom Kippur atones for. Averot sheben adam lechavero ein Yom Kippurim mechaper ad sheyiratzeh et chavero. Sins between one person and another, Yom Kippur does not atone for those sins until you reconcile with your friend. In other words, you can stand for 25 hours on Yom Kippur and pray, and you can beat your chest 44 times during the Al Chet, and you can beat yourself 22 times during Ashamnu. It makes absolutely no difference if you didn't ask forgiveness from a person that you wronged. So this idea of reconciling with our friends and neighbors and family goes straight back to the Mishnah, and of course the Rambam in his beautiful fashion summarizes it in his code of Jewish law. But in terms of actually seeing our families, look, we're all frustrated. For a few months, my wife and I, believe it or not, have a total of 20 grandchildren. For about 2 months, we couldn't see our grandchildren except by Zoom. Needless to say, this was rather frustrating. The first thing we did in May when they let us out of our cages is we went to see our grandchildren. And since then, on and off, we have seen our grandchildren. And we'll find out soon what's going to happen between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It could be we're all going into lockdown again. So you do the best that you can do. Thank God we have Zoom and these other modern tools that we didn't have just a few years ago. A few years ago, Zoom was science fiction. You know, I always associated Zoom with Star Trek. Now everybody has Zoom and uses it or similar tools nonstop. And it's not the same as seeing your children and grandchildren physically, but it's the next best thing. And I urge you to do that in honor of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The last thing I'll discuss is, if that's the last question, is Seth Rogen. I don't know Seth Rogen personally. I must confess, Al Chet, I remember my sins today. I have never seen a movie made by Seth Rogen. I don't have time to waste on such narishkeit. But he obviously is a very successful comedian and a very successful filmmaker. I was very distressed to hear what he had said. I wasn't distressed because he was an ignorant Jew. He's not an ignorant Jew. Apparently, he went to day school and to Jewish summer camps. It's hard for me to conceive that a person who went to a day school and Jewish summer camps could be so incredibly ignorant of Jewish history. What he said was total nonsense. No, he didn't understand why the Jews need a place for security, a place to run to. Well, anybody who has a 6th grade knowledge of Jewish history knows why the Jews need a home, and that they had no place to run to for thousands of years as they were persecuted and killed throughout the world in almost every country in the world. So a person who doesn't know that basic fact, maybe he slept through day school or slept through summer camp and wasn't actually listening to anything that he had been taught. But clearly, if a young man who went to day school and Jewish summer camps doesn't know these basic lessons of Jewish history, then we all have homework to do, and we have to make sure to improve our curriculum, especially vis-a-vis Israel. And many years ago, in the introduction, Michael said that I was a student at Hebrew University, and I got 2 teaching certificates, and people always say to me, why did you need 2? Was one how to teach and the other not how to teach? No. The 2 teaching certificates, one was to teach in Israel, and the other was to teach in the diaspora. And one of the courses that I took was called How to Teach Israel in the Diaspora. And what I did for my papers in that course is I read some of the Israel textbooks that they were using in Hebrew schools and day schools in the 1970s. And there is the problem. Those textbooks were very good at praising the state of Israel and talking about the ingathering of the exiles and talking about the revival of the Hebrew language, which was all true. Everything about Israel is a miracle. The problem is that Israel had no warts. Israel had no problems. Israel was just this ideal place that absorbed immigrants and taught people Hebrew, and everything was hunky-dory. If we want to let our young people deal with the real problems of the world, and with Israel real problems, we have to teach them Israel's real problems. And Israel has problems vis-a-vis minorities, and Israel has problems vis-a-vis poor people and immigrants, just like any other country in the world. And it's important that along with the miracles of Israel's rebirth, which are truly miraculous, and I believe are unprecedented in all of human history, in addition to the miracles, we have to teach Israel's real problems so that our young people will have a real understanding, not only of the miracles of the state of Israel, but the problems that Israel faces and the way that it deals with those problems. So I think that we need to rewrite some of our textbooks. We need to rewrite the way that we teach our young people about Israel. And hopefully, if we do it properly, they will not come out saying things like Seth Rogen said. Because what he said showed that he had absolutely no understanding of the importance of the state of Israel, not only of what a miracle it is, but also that it has problems and how it is dealt with those problems. And I think it's very important for us to teach our young people all of these things.
Rabbi, the gentleman, Bobby, who brought up the question originally, made a comment that Seth said that the Jews need to be, if they're concentrated in one place, it's dangerous. Do you have a thought on that? I mean, clearly you presented he doesn't have the foundation
Right.
to understand. Any thoughts?
Right. Well, if you look, I'm a Zionist. I would like all Jews to live in Israel. That's why I moved here when I was 17 years old. But if you look throughout Jewish history, almost in every period of Jewish history, there were Jews living in Israel and there were Jews living in the diaspora. When the Jews returned to the land of Israel from the Babylonian exile in the year 516 BCE, you all know the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, only a small percentage returned to the land of Israel. Most of the Jews who were exiled to Babylon stayed in Babylon. We don't even know why. We don't have the details. Other than the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and the book of Ezekiel, we don't have any historical testimonies about what exactly went on at that period of time. But the fact of the matter is, if you add up all the people in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah who returned to the land of Israel in Shivat Zion, in the return to Zion, it's a few thousand people. It's a very small number of people. And the same thing through the Talmudic period. There were Jews living in Israel, and there were Jews living in Alexandria and in Rome and in Babylon and all sorts of other places. So there have always been Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora. And we could argue back and forth. Is it a healthy thing? Is it not a healthy thing? It's simply a fact of Jewish history. And I think that what we need to do is the Jews of Israel need to help the Jews of the diaspora, and the Jews of the diaspora need to help the Jews of Israel. Whether Seth is right about putting all our eggs in one basket, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, that's not the situation. There are 6 million Jews living in Israel. There's roughly the same amount of Jews, slightly more, living in the diaspora. And what we need to do is concentrate on helping each other without saying that one is better than the other. And I think I can conclude I don't know if you have any more questions, but this past Tuesday, I had the privilege of speaking at an academic conference, which was supposed to be held in person, but was held on Zoom. It was the 100th anniversary of the murder of Professor Israel Friedlander. And if you don't know who Israel Friedlander was, when we get off this Zoom lesson, please look him up on Rabbi Google. Rabbi Professor Israel Friedlander was one of the founding professors of JTS. He taught Bible at JTS from 1903, and he was murdered in the Ukraine in July 5th, 1920, on a mission of mercy to bring money to the Jews of Ukraine after the pogroms there. And Israel Friedlander was, on the one hand, a tremendous Zionist. He was a disciple of Achad Ha'am. He believed that Zion, the state of Israel, or there was no state then, Israel needs to be the spiritual center of the Jewish people, and we need to do everything we can to foster a connection to Zionism and the land of Israel. On the other hand, he was opposed to Shlilat HaGolah. Shlilat HaGolah is a fancy way of saying the negation of the diaspora. It was very common among Zionists 100 years ago to say that we have no need for the diaspora. Let's all make Aliyah and close down all the diaspora Jewish communities. And Israel Friedlander said, no, we have to do everything we can to build Israel as a center, a cultural and spiritual center for the Jewish people, like Achad Ha'am said, and we need to do everything we can to foster strong Jewish life in the diaspora. So Israel Friedlander said it over 100 years ago. It's still true today. We have to teach our children about Zionism, but we also have to teach them about Judaism, because those are two sides of the same coin. Without Zionism, there is no Judaism, and without Judaism, there is no Zionism. I'm quoting Friedlander. And these are the values we need to pass on to our children and grandchildren. Both are equally important.
So Rabbi, I was going to tail up at the last question, and that came up here is why is Sephardic history never included in the Jewish school text in Israel history? And we'll make that the last one.
No, in Israel, Sephardic Jewry is included in textbooks. I think we have a bigger problem that in the Western world, the Sephardic story is not usually included, because most of the Jews, whether they live in Argentina, Uruguay, the United States, Canada, etc., are not Sephardim, they're Ashkenazim. So the normal history told or taught, for example, in the day schools that I attended in North America, is Ashkenazic Jewish history. And I don't think it's done out of any ill will. They're teaching the history of their ancestors, of the people who are doing the teaching. In Israel, 50% of Israelis come from Islamic lands, Sephardic Jewry in Islamic lands, whether it's North Africa, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, the Balkan countries where they spoke Ladino. And those subjects are integrated into the Israeli school curriculum. And I'm very proud to say that one of our MA tracks at Schechter, we have 13 MA tracks in the Schechter Institute. One of our MA tracks is called Jews of Spain and Islamic Lands. And we founded that MA track over 20 years ago, I think 25 years ago in the mid-1990s. In other words, we have an MA track that's devoted to the subject of Jews, Sephardic Jews and Jews of Islamic lands. This is a very important subject that is taught in the state of Israel because half of Israeli Jews come from those countries. And these are, of course, things that we have to encourage. And I'll give you one last example of this. At Schechter, we offer adult ed courses every semester in both Hebrew and English. I'm happy to say that starting this semester, there will be courses offered in English at a time when people in California can participate. Go to the Schechter Institute website and look for the adult ed courses. There'll be 3 courses taught this coming semester in English, where the time is such that people can participate. One of our most popular courses taught in Hebrew every semester is Ladino, the Ladino language, which has been taught on level 1 and level 2. In other words, there's a revival of interest in Ladino in Israel, just as there is a revival of interest in Yiddish. Israelis want to learn about their Ashkenazic ancestors who spoke Yiddish. They wanted to learn about their Sephardic ancestors who spoke Ladino. So these are two sides of the coin of Jewish history, and we need to teach both sides of those coins.
Fascinating, fascinating facts. Here's a wish from one of our attendees, is that would you ever consider speaking about forgiveness at some point?
Absolutely.
Okay. Another question
can
came
forgive
up.
me and invite me again. I'll talk about forgiveness.
That's a good arrangement. And there's also questions of, can folks reach out to you via email to
Sure.
ask further questions? That's okay. We'll respond
Sure.
back to all
You
the
have my email. Farshad has my email. Please feel free to write me questions.
And folks, clearly want to figure out if they can, support the Schechter Institute and also attend your classes.
Well, thank you very much. If you want to support Schechter, just go to the Schechter Institute website. Our office is in Philadelphia, but it's in the virtual world. And of course, you can make a donation there. There's a donate button. And in terms of courses that we offer, what we're planning on doing, and we have to figure out a way to let you know this, since Shavuot, we started offering Zoom sessions for every Jewish holiday. We had a big tikkun on Zoom. Before Shavuot, 275 people participated. We just had a tikkun for Rosh Hashanah, not a tikkun, a Zoom session for Rosh Hashanah. I gave the first class and then I got out in order to join you. We had 4 lessons about Rosh Hashanah. When I began, 50 people were online. I don't know how many people were online by the end. And we intend to do these Zoom sessions for Hanukkah, Tu B'Shvat, Purim, etc. So we just need to find a way to get you the flyer so you can send it out to people so that they can participate.
Fantastic. You've been extremely generous with your wisdom and your time with us, of which we're all grateful for. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I just say, if you visit the Schechter Institute website, other than making a donation, which is obviously always welcome, there is a huge amount of material there in English that you can use. There are 14 years of my responsa. I publish a responsa 6 to 8 times every year on the internet, answering a specific question in Jewish law. There are many articles by our faculty on various areas of Jewish studies. So you'll see there, one of the rubrics is something like learn and study or something like that. If you go to that rubric on the Schechter Institute website, there is a wealth of articles, responsa, and also videos on many different aspects of Jewish studies.
Yeah, by the way, I think it's an understatement of a wealth. It's a treasure trove. I started to go through it and I only got to the tip of the iceberg. So wonderful wisdom there.
Enjoy.
Thank you. So just in closure, I'm sorry.
So in closure, Tiva v'chatima tova, may you be written and inscribed in the book of life. May you take some of these lessons that we learned today, humility, gratitude, standing still, and turning curses into blessings, and also spreading kindness. And may we soon meet both on Zoom and in person.
Amen.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Closure, thank you so much. Thank you so much. We went over in timing, but grateful for everybody attending. Thank you, Mark and Carrie and Farshad, for the brainchild for bringing you to the table. I think the credit goes to all of them. We'll follow up with an email to everyone with this recorded link and how to contact you. And maybe we could put in some of there on your classes. And thank you for making all of us kinder people and realizing the power of Hashem today. Thank you so much.
Toda rabba. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Be well.
Thank you.